Hello everyone, I'm Emily Brooks from Smart Brief. We are very happy to be hosting today's webinar on reading intervention with Foundations in Learning. At this time, I'd like to introduce Carolyn Brown of Foundations in Learning, who will be today's moderator. Carolyn?
Thank you very much, Emily, and hello and welcome to all of those who have joined the webinar, and especially to our panelists who will be participating today. We're very excited to introduce them to you. And I'm very pleased to be the moderator today. As Emily said, the webinar will deal with special needs students with a new model when the traditional mastery model doesn't work. And our agenda today will first begin with the Marietta City Schools with a team of educators working with special needs students, and they will describe their school and the students, and then they'll talk about why an alternative to their traditional models actually has been necessary and some early findings. And then I'll introduce you to Dr. Bob McMurray from the University of Iowa, and he'll actually talk about the varied practice model as an alternative. We'll touch briefly on access code, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers from all the participants. So as we're going through the webinar, if you have questions, please enter them in the chat section of your screen, and we'll either answer them at the end of the section or we'll take care of them during the Q&A section. But we encourage and look forward to your participation. Your panel today, as I just mentioned, will be Dr. Bob McMurray, a team of 4 special educators from Marietta City Schools, and I, Dr. Carolyn Brown, will be moderating this session. And before we get started, I think it's always easier as we talk about students and intervention if we actually can think about a student in particular. And I would like to introduce you to Jessica before we get started this morning. Jessica is in 3rd grade, and actually by the time she was in 3rd grade, she had already been designated for special education. She was a very highly motivated youngster, very anxious to learn to read, to do well in school, and simply didn't catch on like other children did. And from the time she was in kindergarten, she began interventions for early reading problems and continued those through 2nd grade. And despite these interventions, she still struggled with fluency and reading comprehension. She lacked automaticity, and she could not generalize any of the rules that were given to her in a variety of formats. And her particular struggles, like many children who do struggle learning to read, were in very specific areas. She couldn't, in decoding, she couldn't distinguish vowel ambiguities and struggled with lack of any one-to-one correspondence. She really struggled using the structure of the syllable and couldn't chunk multisyllabic words, and didn't understand that phrases in text mapped to underlying syntax. So even though she had very good oral language skills coming into school, she wasn't able to exploit those as she moved into reading. So what is very clear about these youngsters, that if we don't catch them early and keep them enthusiastic about learning, they lose their sense of themselves as a good learner and a good reader, and there's a real danger that she won't make it in junior high, and then by high school she's dropped out. And many of these students actually do leave high school without graduating. So what I would like to do next with that brief introduction to a particular student is introduce the team that is with us today from Marietta City Schools. And Dr. Donna Ryan has actually served for 7 years now as an assistant superintendent for special services in the Marietta City Schools. She comes to Marietta with a PhD in student with exceptionalities from Georgia State, and she has had experience teaching students with disabilities at every grade level, K to 12. She's designed alternative programs that are still up and running, and she is a very serious, committed, and innovative problem solver. With her today are David Walker, Carla Brooks, and Kate Huntley. And I will let Donna do further introductions of them, but she has an incredible team of people who are trying to solve how to select and implement their Tier 2 students in the most appropriate interventions. And with that, Donna or Dr. Ryan, I would like to just hand the mic to you.
Well, thank you so much, Carolyn. And of course, please call me Donna. We're really excited to be a part of this webinar today because, as many school systems would probably agree, we're all out there trying to solve very similar problems. We have many Jessicas who call Marietta City their home, and I would start today's webinar by talking a little bit about some of the similarities as well as some of the differences from your first webinar as to how it would tie to today's in relation to some of the experts that I have seated about me. In Marietta City Schools, we're a very unique school system in that we're considered a suburb of Metro Atlanta. We're a metro school system. But many of our elementary schools that serve our one high school are really more like suburban, if you will. We serve both the most affluent students who reside in Marietta City as well as the most needy students imaginable. And as a result, we have a very unique challenge in Marietta City that really allows us to benefit from the very innovative superintendent that we have serving our system, Dr. Emily Lembeck, who actually was just named our state superintendent of the year for this past year. So we're in a very unique position that we have some of the best employees here working with us, yet we face some of the greatest challenges in our immediate area. We have approximately 8,300 students that we serve, and we're growing. One of the other things that I can say about us is the fact that our diversity is very unique. We serve approximately 45% of our students are Black, 30% of our students are Hispanic, many of which also have English language learning needs, and about 20% are white with 5% other. One of the things that I like to tell people when we describe Marietta City, which is why it takes an expert group like you're going to meet today, is that we're very unique in that there is no real normal in Marietta City. I use the example of the parent who maybe has two very different children. One might be 6 feet 2 inches tall, one might be 5 feet 1 inch tall, and on average, they're, you know, mid 5-footers. But really, neither of their two children is quote-unquote average height. And that's the kind of way that we approach things here in Marietta City. We have very divergent learners, and we have to think about each of them as individuals as opposed to trying to shoot to the middle and work with the quote-unquote average child. In order to accomplish this task, we work with a team of experts, some of which we have before us. David Walker, as you mentioned, is a school psychologist, and he works with a team of 3 other school psychologists to meet the unique needs of our children as we look at eligibility specific to Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We have Carla Brooks, who represents one of our programs, if you will, to meet at-risk learners. It's early intervention program that many school systems across the states probably also have. And then we have Kate Huntley, who, as a teacher who's taught in many different areas, is working right now to serve as our intervention coach, someone who looks at those children as they move through the different tiers, focusing primarily on the Tier 1 instruction being our sound base, and then looking at what we can do to intervene with children if those Tier 1 instructional techniques are not meeting students' needs. Do you want to go ahead and go to the next slide, and we'll move on from there?
Yes.
Okay, so as we try and look at our different challenges, I was going to have David try and tell us a little bit about how we use information gained in the different areas that you might see on your screen to identify children.
And so I'm David Walker, and I'm a school psychologist here in Marietta City Schools. And so one of the things that I wanted to talk about was that whole process of identifying disabilities, specifically specific learning disabilities that tend to academically impact students.
So if you'll go to the next slide, we'll actually focus on the different areas under specific learning disabilities.
So as you can see from this, there are a myriad of academic areas that a student can be impacted in. And for me, as a school psychologist, teachers come to me as a resource so that I can aid them in the process of identifying whether a student has a legitimate learning disability. And so for me, what I view myself as, and I use the analogy, I'm a detective. And so what I'm doing is collecting evidence that would suggest that we have a student who is struggling with a disability. So the starting point is an academic deficit in one or more of the areas that you see on your screen. And so what we do is try to pull back those layers and gather the evidence and look at all the pieces that will suggest a specific learning disability. So there are a bunch of different pieces of evidence that we typically collect, and they can go from the most likely thing that will cause the student to not perform academically, for example, a difficulty with hearing or seeing, all the way to the least likely, which is that the student has a real impacting disability. And so what we typically do is when we spread out all of that evidence, the best piece of evidence that we have at our disposal is whether or not that student has responded to research-based intervention. So when I look in my arsenal of tools, the number one thing that I want to look at is, has this student been exposed to a research-based intervention, and has this student been able to progress as a result of that intervention, or have they not? And if they haven't, then that is one more humongous piece of evidence that I have to make my case. Now, if the student hasn't responded, then we can refer the child for a psychological evaluation, and we can use my results from that psychological evaluation in conjunction with the data that's been collected to make the case that the student has a legitimate disability.
And that's really critical. What David's saying here, of course, is what we're going to do with children if they enter Tier 4, but we have a number of children who might be showing some progress, maybe not exactly what we need. And that's why people like Kate being a member of that team is very critical. She's able to look at those high numbers of students who we know are at risk, could potentially have a disability, but we want to make sure it's not just a learning difference, which is why we need the support of an intervention coach.
And you'll hear, this is Kate, the intervention coach, and you'll hear from us on two different perspectives. One for those students who, as David discussed, have truly been found to have a learning disability in the area of reading. And we'll also talk about our students who are in the response to intervention model with perhaps suspected reading difficulties, or students for whom our Tier 1 instruction has not been adequate to move their reading skills. As all districts across the country have grappled with embracing response to intervention, I've been, and Dr. Ryan, we've been very careful to help our schools understand what is best practice and what is an intervention. And indeed, we've adopted very few web-based or computer-assisted programs or tools, because often what they provide is practice. Access Code is, I think, the only one for reading that we have looked at that we consider a true intervention, which is, I think, from my perspective, why I'm very excited about this. It provides direct, explicit instruction. It provides opportunities for teachers to look at the progress monitoring and the student response and stop and come and pull those students aside and provide them with additional teacher direct instruction. And that's a big part that's made this actually quite an eye-opener for me in terms of what Access Code can provide. For our students who are already in special education, we have in the last few years embraced even more rigorous, intensive reading interventions. And we're very proud of that, yet we are finding that in most cases it's not enough. Because our students may master some skills within that program, but then do not transfer and generalize those skills to other programs. We see that they still are not applying those skills effectively. And these are students that fall under the term of dyslexia in many cases, and what we see is even with good intervention, there is still a resistance to intervention because it is truly a processing deficit. We're very excited with Access Code to see how that's going to help us really move those students from being able to decode within the program we use to employing access code and seeing our students be able to apply these skills in different contexts and almost take it to that metacognitive level where they start understanding how to apply those skills in many different situations.
So what we can do at this point is really talk about, well, we've got these areas of specific learning disabilities, but what is it about this software intervention that allows us to work with the student within the confines of our classroom setting? So if you'll advance to the next slide, we'll have Carla speak a little bit to what she sees in her classroom, which is an early intervention program classroom, and how this varied practice model allows her to support the needs of her students in a way that she was not able to do before using this supplemental program.
This is Carla Brooks, and I work with students through the Early Intervention Program. Many of them are in the RTI process, but not all of them. Most of them, if I screen them individually, know their beginning sounds, will know some of their vowel sounds, but they aren't able to apply those. And that's what we've found to be really exciting about this program, is that it takes those skills and will provide them with activities where they have to apply those skills in a variety of different settings and on words starting with single syllable and moving up to multi-syllable words, so that they will generalize the principles. We also have found that it's really useful. I can serve a large group of students. The program, some of my students will end up being placed in the special education program, and the program can move with them. No time is lost. We just transfer it to that teacher, and that actually tends to be something the students ask about because they enjoy the program and they want to be sure that they're not going to have to stop working in it. It also has been very cost-effective for us, and we're looking at ways we can expand it because you're able to work with a larger group of students, because while the students are working on it, I can have a larger group in there than I normally would, and I pull them off one by one to read with them, and at the end I might do some of the spelling activities or some of the other activities that they suggest, but you really can have a large number of children utilizing the program with one teacher. And I think that's going to lend it to being a very useful program to use in before and after school programs, or as we look at ways to extend the school day for these students, because with Common Core we're finding the day is so packed and there aren't that many opportunities to pull students out without them missing vital instruction, and yet we also need to help them solidify these reading skills. And a program like this can be used in a before-after school program to help extend the school day.
One of the things we like so much about this program actually being computer-based as opposed to where we've typically shied away from these is back to what Kate was telling you earlier in terms of us making sure that the programs are implemented with fidelity. We've even had parents, very well-intentioned parents, who want to support the types of formal explicit instructions that their children are receiving during the school day. They want to work with their children at home. But one of the concerns that we've heard from some of our teachers is that this early learning for these students is so critical that we can't afford an error per se, an error perhaps in the delivery of the actual phoneme itself, an error in how those sounds blend together to make words, what types of skills the child should be practicing to ensure that they have more of an error-free, if you will, practice session to keep their motivation high. And yet this program does allow us to almost provide some supports to a parent who might be trying to work with their child at home, while at the same time allowing the teacher to monitor their progress through the computer, through the tools that you have built into the software such that that can be done. I'm going to let Kate speak a little bit more to how this program supports them in that way, or we can move on to Dr. McMurray to talk a little bit about the varied practice model itself.
I would like to add one of my frustrations through the years of being both, I've been a classroom teacher in general ed, I've been a special education teacher, an early intervention teacher, and a teacher for students who are learning English. And one of my frustrations has been that I may do some very intensive reading work with them in the classroom part of the day, and there is never enough time for the repeated exposures that they need. or they are in situations where they are trying to apply skills but doing it incorrectly, and therefore the incorrect skill is being reinforced. And this, I think, really addresses that need. I have often coached teachers that we need to give students repeated exposures throughout the day, even if it's for 5 or 10 minutes. And especially as we move to Common Core, there's less and less of that time in the day, and it's really a struggle for teachers. Access Code, to me, can really provide that, and it reassures me that I think we're going to see much better gains with our students because they will get that immediate feedback and correction and repeated rehearsal and exposure. Dr. Ryan?
We have found that one of the challenges that we have in Marietta City when we try and think about what you would consider an inclusive classroom, if you will, we do have an ability to serve a myriad of different kinds of learners. Our challenge has been that our children are so transient in many of our elementary schools that which we might be able to apply and apply well over a school year might only allow us 4, 6, 8, 10 weeks with a child before perhaps they might be transferring to another location. And so what's so nice about this program is that oftentimes in just 26 weeks, we find that we can fill the gaps of a child who may not have had for some reason an opportunity to take in all of the instruction, the good phonics instruction that might have even been introduced to them in a traditional classroom because they're so transient. So we think about, with the rigor of the new curriculum, we can't really accommodate the redos that are necessary for some of our children that are coming in and out of our schools. And so this program allows us to almost shrink, if you will, what kinds of supports might be expected to be used with a child across the school year into a condensed period of time of what we found to be about 26 weeks. It's also very cost effective. We think about resources with our children. The resources are the materials, if you will, but they're also the resources in terms of the teachers. We want students to have one-to-one access to a classroom teacher. And I like to say that there's no way to replace, quote-unquote, if you will, the power of a really highly trained teacher. Our children need to remain in their classrooms with good differentiated instruction from that grade level content area expert every day. But at the same time, we know that we're going to need to provide some supports for those same children, and it's probably going to have to be outside that school day because they can't afford to be missing what those other children are getting during that time that they would traditionally be pulled out. So again, when we think about our new Common Core, we think about the way the language is written for those who are familiar with the standards. They have to be able to know and apply at a grade level, if you will. And at first grade or kindergarten level, that means one thing. It might be that one-on-one correspondence. But by the time those kids get to 3rd grade, we're talking about technical, nonfiction text that these children are having to try and apply that which they've learned from decoding to this comprehension. And we're finding that they're not able to do it unless we can provide more opportunities for them to practice at those decoding skills. Carla, we do see these kids in the general education classroom, and we do see the teachers really trying to figure out how to differentiate instruction for those children. Did you want to add any more about how you're doing that in your EIP classroom?
Yes, one type of student that I have a lot of in my EIP program would be your ADHD type student. And this program works very well for them because, first of all, computers, by their very nature, tend to keep them very highly engaged, but it also requires responses. Everything requires an immediate response, so the student has to be involved in their learning, and it helps to keep them attending to the program, and it's something they really seem to enjoy. It also helps that if they make a mistake, it doesn't hurt their self-esteem. The computer will say, you didn't master that lesson, would you like to try again now, or would you like to do it later? One thing I really like about the program is that it gives the students a lot of choices. They choose the order in which they do the activities. They can choose whether to repeat the lesson then or have it come up later. So they take ownership of doing the program, and I've even found if there's a reason why I have to be out and miss a class, I can have them assigned to do it in their regular classroom, and they can get on there. They're asking me if they can do it at home. So it has really caught their interest, and it's something they're doing whenever they get the chance to do.
We do have several children in our school system that are perhaps lacking in the area of confidence. They might not enjoy reading. They've experienced a lot of failure before they even come to us because of, as I mentioned, their transients. And so it's one of the other areas, this program is one of the other areas that we're interested in seeing whether it will help support children who might perhaps lack confidence in the area of reading, especially if they have a disability that actually impacts them in terms of processing.
Right. And so why that's important is so many times we get kids with so many different things going on. And so for me, on my end of the spectrum, if a child can make it to me as a school psychologist to the point that I am now giving them a comprehensive evaluation, if I can be sure that the reason that they're struggling isn't because of a lack of confidence or a lack of self-efficacy, then again, that's another piece of evidence that I have in my bag that supports the idea that I'm dealing with a legitimate disability. So if the students are engaged in a computer program and it's building that confidence and that skill, then that is something that I can really use when I'm assessing that to determine if I'm looking at a legitimate disability.
So as you can see, we could talk for days. We've got really just to summarize, if you will, why are we testing this new approach? We have several challenges in Marietta City that we feel are probably challenges in other systems as well. We might only have a half a year or less with a child that we in the past might have felt like we had a year to intervene. We have some students who we found that the mastery approach really just doesn't seem to quite be enough. They need a different way to practice in a way that we believe will generalize to new things. And we have some kids who are coming to us that are 2 or more years behind, and when that's the case, we need to have that healthy sense of urgency of really breaking the walls down, if you will, of the traditional classroom day and figuring out how to extend it with a program that allows us to implement with fidelity despite perhaps some formal training that might otherwise be necessary by that content area teacher. The last example we'll give is we might have some upper grade teachers who maybe have not been responsible for instruction in primary grades, and they don't have the skills and necessarily the time to learn how to teach something like phonemic awareness or phonics. Access code really can provide that scope and sequence for those skills, and that teacher therefore can remain as that curriculum expert while at the same time knowing that those children are going to have the supports that they need to fill those holes in those areas that the program addresses. And again,
this is Carolyn again.
And with other school systems.
I would like to thank Donna, Kate, David, and Carla for a very quick discussion about their students and what their students' needs are. And we appreciate that you have shared that with us, and we will, I'm sure, refer later back to you with some of the questions that we see are coming in. At this time, I would like to segue to introduce Professor McMurray. He, I am pleased to say, is a colleague and a collaborator with us at the University of Iowa, and he's an associate professor in 2 departments, in communication sciences and disorders and in psychology. This year, he earned the very prestigious Young Scientist Award from the American Psychological Association. And this is really important to our discussion today, having him here, because he is one of the world-leading experts in learning theory and with particular expertise in the very practice model. And beyond any particular product or curriculum, I think that Professor McMurray can help us understand why another approach might be appropriate for these youngsters who do struggle so trying to learn to read. Dr. McMurray, as we look broadly at these youngsters with special needs, they need a lot of things in order to learn the same skills as what we might consider more typical learners. They actually need more practice, more focused feedback. They often struggle with generalization. They may not even know what to attend to, and they're not attending to the right things. And it's very difficult for them to achieve automaticity. If you could just talk to us broadly about what this suggests about their learning?
Well, if you look at these kids with these types of problems as a cognitive scientist, this has all the hallmarks of what we would call procedural learning. These are the same challenges that we struggle with when we try to teach people new skills, things like playing the piano or driving a car. And if we think about learning as learning of a skill as opposed to learning knowledge, this might be a useful model in terms of how to approach these children. We have lots and lots of studies, lots of data on how procedural learning works in general, and if we can shift to thinking about decoding, about fluency, about word attack skills in terms of skills, we might actually make a little more headway. Now that's a big shift in terms of how we teach, and I think our colleagues from Marietta City Schools illustrated that, I think, fairly well, but it's an important shift.
Well, so what do you mean exactly? How is learning a skill different from other kinds of knowledge?
Well, when we learn a skill like shooting a basketball, sailing, or even something that seems intensely cognitive like chess, we gain the ability to work very intuitively. We don't have to think about it or reason about it. It's typically very fast, and it's typically very unconscious. So, for example, when we're driving a car, we don't remember that we have to push the brakes to stop, or reason that if the car ahead of us is stopping, we also need to stop. We just do it. Your foot just gravitates to the right place, and you do it very instinctively. Now, the key with any kind of skill learning, though, is to learn how to do this in a way that promotes people to generalize the skill to new situations and to flexibly use that skill in different situations. So imagine if you only learned to drive on your own cul-de-sac with no traffic. You wouldn't learn to drive flexibly. You would learn to drive in very particular ways. You wouldn't know how to drive at high speed. You wouldn't know how to weave in and out of traffic or enter the on-ramp. These are all issues that probably arise quite frequently in Atlanta. And so we need to train skills in a way that can be done very flexibly so that we can apply them. It's very easy to derail skill learning by giving too narrow of a base for practice or by giving sort of inappropriate practice.
I think that is a perfect way for us to begin thinking about reading when you say we can derail skill learning by making the practice too narrow. Can you take that to reading now, what you've just said?
Sure. So I think that it's this critical distinction between skills and knowledge. We want children to read without thinking about it. They shouldn't be mouthing the phonics rules to themselves as they read a vowel. They need to be immediately pronouncing the words fluently or immediately accessing the words. It's a very complex set of skills, and that's exactly what we want kids to do. Now, we often teach kids about reading in terms of knowledge. We talk about it using things like whether kids get the concept of a syllable or understand the rules, right? We tend to conceptualize our task in terms of knowledge. And the contrast, of course, is with performance. We want kids to just be able to do it. I think the classic sort of phonics rules really illustrate this. We teach kids very explicit rules that when there's a silent E at the end of the words, they use the long form of the vowel, diphthongs are pronounced a certain way, that sort of thing. And then we try to teach them to apply these rules in various situations. We encourage kids to think about and reason about these rules. And actually that works pretty well for a lot of kids. But I think the whole point of today's webinar is that for the kids that fail, we might want to consider the model that skill learning or procedural learning offers. And one reason for this, one intuitive reason for this, is that explicit and rational knowledge just doesn't do a great job describing reading. When linguists have dug into the phonics system of English or the grapheme phoneme correspondence rules of English, they actually had to develop over 1,200 different phonics rules to describe the English spelling system. And of course, even within that, there are still exceptions. So if we try to think of this as a system of knowledge, no one could possibly master it. We need to think about it as a system of flexible skills.
So what does all this mean then for teaching, and then particularly teaching of reading?
Well, I think it matters a great deal, but it changes the emphasis in important ways. It takes the emphasis off of what and how we teach, and in my view, it correctly puts the emphasis on how kids learn. How kids learn and the conditions under which kids learn is critical to success, and how we need to teach should be based on this. And I think that the principles we can extract from the research on skill learning, or procedural learning can be incorporated into virtually any curriculum or approach. So we've talked a bit about the access code model, but I think there's lots of different ways you could build these principles into your learning. What we're trying to do is tune how we teach and the environments that we make for learning along the lines of how kids actually learn.
Okay, well, I think if you can tell us then what we've learned or what cognitive science tells us, what the research has told us about how people actually learn new skills.
Well, one of the critical things that we see is the importance of variability. Just like in the driving example, you would never learn to drive driving the same car on the same roads in the same time of day with the same other drivers around. You need to learn it in lots of different ways. You need to learn to drive on the highway. You need to learn to drive on the city. It's not just knowing the rules about when to push the accelerator and when to turn the wheel. It's this complex set of relationships, and reading is exactly like this. And we know that from the laboratory work, people need this kind of variability to learn automatic skills. So for example, work on basketball players learning to shoot foul shots. They learn better if they learn from different distances. Work on pilots learning to land planes. Something even as simple as changing the color of the ground around the runway leads to better learning as they start to learn the correct way to approach the runway. Work in my own lab looking at 14-month-old infants. We've tried to teach infants to distinguish very similar sounding words like book and poop, and we've actually found that they do better if they're exposed to lots and lots of different talkers as to being exposed to just one. Now why is it, in all of these cases, why does variability help? Well, in all of these cases, what people are varying and what I've been varying are things that are actually irrelevant to what we're trying to teach them. The color of the ground isn't relevant to landing. Who says a word isn't relevant to what the kid is experiencing, as whether it's the word boop or poop. And it's when the stuff that isn't relevant varies, the stuff that is relevant sort of pops out. And the critical factor raised by all of these studies is that we can't assume that children know what the relevant parts of a problem are. We can't assume that pilots know to ignore the color of the ground, or that basketball players learn to ignore the distance between the foul shot, or that kids learn to ignore what the talker is. They tend to lock on whatever is there, and I think we see this a lot in our struggling readers. And what variability does is it helps those things that are really important pop out.
So if you could, and I know that you've covered a lot of ground very quickly, but if you could apply this in some very specific ways to reading and the way children use information to read, and very specifically, if you could give us examples of what you're trying to get to pop out and how it actually does pop out for kids so they get it.
Sure, let's take the example from decoding of vowels. Vowels are incredibly difficult for early readers, and especially struggling readers. The phonics rules are very ambiguous. For example, an E followed by an A can be pronounced as an E, like in the word bee, but it can also be S, as in head. And kids don't always know the difference between vowels and consonants. They don't understand the important role of vowels in organizing the syllable. Now, the knowledge-based or mastery-based approach would be that kids need to get this concept, and need to understand it. And what this really means is that kids need to understand conceptually that consonants are on the end, vowels are in the middle, and that they play different roles in the pronunciation of the word. Now, how do we teach them this? Well, under a traditional, more mastery approach, we would use something like word families. We've all used these, they're very common. We hold everything constant except for the vowel. So, for example, they might get mat and mate, rad and rate, fat and fate, to teach them that the silent E is really critical for how that A is pronounced. So that's the sort of mastery approach. This seems to make the problem easier because the vowel is the only thing that is variable. But if kids don't know how syllables work, if they don't know that the vowel is important, they may erroneously associate all those T's with the proper pronunciation. And now they're left with something that's fairly ambiguous to them.
So what does skill learning say about this?
Well, skill learning says what they really need is variability in those consonants. That if you give them lots of different consonants at the either end of the vowels, the only thing that's available for them to learn from will be the vowels. And that's what's going to allow them to learn those more invariant phonics rules.
So even though it seems a bit counterintuitive, you're saying that when we make it too simple and spoon feed, and they don't know what to pay attention to, they may not be having that experience of what pops out that's relevant.
That's exactly right. Now, we actually tested this recently in a short study we conducted in the West Des Moines School District. What we did was we taught kids 6 different phonics rules over the course of about 3 days, a couple of short vowels and a couple of long vowels, and we tested them before and after. Now, the critical thing we did was half the kids got a very traditionally structured set of words that had a lot of similarity in the consonants. The other kids got a lot of variability. They were all tested in the same way, however. What we found was that the group receiving variability, which you can see on the right in this graph, had almost twice as big of gains as the group that got similar consonants, and this was highly significant. Now, the other thing we found was when we broke it down by different levels of readers. What I'm showing you right here are the high performers. These were the kids in our sample of about 250 kids who really scored the best. And you can see that for the high performers, both groups showed significant learning. They showed significant increases in performance between pre and post-test. There was much better performance for variability. When we switched to the low performers, we found no learning for the low performers that were exposed to similar words, and quite significant learning for the low performers that got variable words. So in this case, the variability seemed to be essential for getting these kids to learn these words. Now, the other thing we, of course, looked at was generalization. Here we said we're going to test you on either tasks you've seen before or tasks you haven't seen before. Now, you can see in the similar group, if we gave them tasks they'd seen before, they showed more learning. That little green dot on the left is above 0. That means they showed about a 3% gain. That was significant. However, when we gave them new tasks, they failed completely. They showed no evidence for learning. On the other hand, the kids exposed to variability showed robust learning in both cases. So in this case, the variability is really essential for those low-performing kids, but it's also really essential for the kids who are struggling. The idea is that kids don't know what's important. Variability is a way to show them very implicitly, without getting them to think about it, what's important. And using variation along with lots and lots of practice can kind of give them an implicit sense of what the parts of the problem are. And this seems to be really crucial for creating generalization and for helping people who are struggling with reading.
Okay, so I'm just going to sum up again, what you just said, because I think this is really extremely important. You have talked about variability is actually preferred or gets more learning in both old and new tasks with all learners. But that for those students who are struggling, and that would be our youngsters who have special needs or who aren't getting it in the regular way, that for those poorer performers, we actually may have to have variability for them to actually be able to get it and, very importantly, to generalize it. Did I get that?
That is exactly right. Now, the key is not just any variability. You just don't want to change everything willy-nilly. The key is to target the variability to the skills that you're trying to teach. You want to make sure that the things that are relevant are not variable, and the things that are less relevant, but that kids may not have learned to ignore yet, that those are variable. That's what's going to really give these kids the critical insight into this system. And I think that's the really important thing. Now, there's also a bonus for varied practice that actually our colleagues from Marietta alluded to, which is that it's more interesting. The tasks are changing, the words are changing, it keeps the kids engaged. And that's going to give them more practice. It's going to, in the end, give them more variability and more feedback.
And so in terms of the key insights that you have now, can you talk about why all youngsters, but particularly these youngsters, need lots and lots of data? Can you talk about that, the model that varied practice is built on?
Yeah, I think the critical thing is that kids are really learning reading as a skill. Now, some of the kids who are smart enough, can be taught it as knowledge and figure it out. They can do this. Just like if I describe to you how to do something, you can often do it on your own. But the kids who aren't, we really need to focus on what we know about skill learning. What kids and children and adults need when they're learning a skill is lots of feedback. They need lots of variation so they can see how the same skill applies to lots of different contexts. And you need lots of data. We often think about learning now in terms of statistics, in terms of data. They need a lot of words and a lot of practice, coupled with this real-time feedback to get them to sort it out. And I think that's what makes this approach so much more successful with children who are struggling.
So, and along these lines about the principles from skill learning, can you talk about the importance of errors and why the computer might be able to actually address self-discovery and feedback through these errors?
Sure. I mean, one of the other principles that we didn't talk much about today, which is really essential in learning motor skills and any kind of skill, is the principle of feedback. People learn by evaluating their own performance against what they're trying to do. Now, this happens all the time in motor skill learning. If you're driving, you get immediate feedback that you got a little too close to the curb. If you're shooting a basketball, you know that you missed. With reading, it's very hard to deliver in a consistent, immediate way in the classroom. As amazing teachers are, they've got lots of kids doing lots of things all at the same time. And that kind of immediate feedback driven by the student's own individual performance is really difficult to achieve on a consistent basis. Here's where computers can help. Children using computers as a form of practice, as a form of getting more of this data, can get a lot of feedback in a very individualized way, in a very consistent way. And that, I think, is really essential. The other thing that we know from skill learning is there's this sort of balance between self-discovery and feedback. Kids need to kind of come to the right answer on their own, but when they don't, they need feedback about that they didn't or why. And the computer can also help with this. The computer can, for example, constrain the task to make it a little bit easier and a little bit more targeted to the child's own abilities, which gets them more likely to get to it on their own. But if it doesn't, it can deliver immediate feedback to help them get to it via that sort of scaffolding. And so the computer can really target some of these areas of skill learning in a way that's very difficult to do without a real sensitive one-on-one sort of instruction model.
That is, I think we all find it fascinating every time we talk to you, actually, about the work that you're doing in the lab and how that can apply to classrooms around the country. And I think that Dr. Ryan and her group have described their students in a way that hopefully we can see how a varied practice model or something that gives them variability will actually improve their ability to generalize and have more success reading. I would like, before we get to the question and answer period, just to tell you that a very little segue here to access code and actually how it was developed. We did meet Jessica 6 years ago, and we did work with her, and we used a very different model using the varied practice model to expose her to phonics in a way that we hoped would make sense for her. She had had many interventions. Within a year's time, she actually moved from the 14th to the 76th percentile in reading comprehension. She did come with good oral language skills, and that certainly was critical for her to get to grade level so quickly once she figured out actually how the code worked. And then we took those underlying lessons and studies based on the varied practice model, and we did move it to technology because, as you've so aptly stated, technology can actually keep track of what this child is doing, can vary the contrast in very systematic ways if, in fact, we give the computer the information about that performance and where to guide the student next. After doing several small group school-based studies, we did do 2 randomized school-based studies, one in West Des Moines at the elementary level on 2nd to 5th graders, and then we did do one in Bridgeport, Connecticut, which involved 9th grade students who were struggling with readers. And then we actually tested the underlying theory with your lab, Dr. McMurray, with the NSF grant that you just explained to us. So access code, very briefly, for any of the participants, is that we took the issue that students who struggle with fluency and comprehension because they don't have automatic word recognition skills, and we said, can we come up with an approach that can go into the classroom, that can actually in a short amount of time, very effectively and efficiently, get these youngsters to automaticity so they can get on to fluency and comprehension. And what we then married was curriculum and an instructional design that comes delivered in a proven model, but it's delivered by technology. So with those 3 things, we have been able to implement and actually gather data on students of multiple grades and special needs students who made great progress. So very quickly, we took a very systematic approach, as you suggested, Bob. The contrasts were very carefully designed, and we moved from decoding to word attack to phrase recognition very quickly. The model was poured, or the curriculum actually gets poured into this very practice learning model that you described, and it's all delivered so that a youngster is working at on a computer, and her or his experience is personalized. So that our whole aim here is to try to get them to generalize what they're doing because they have automaticity. And we have about 10 minutes left in the webinar, and we would like to actually, we've gotten a series of questions in, and I think we will just take a moment to sort through those and try to organize them in a way that we can hit many of them. And we appreciate very much that the audience has been participating as Dr. Ryan's team and Dr. McMurray have been speaking. I know that sometimes individuals at this point move on and they leave the webinar. If any of you are leaving now but you would like any additional information, feel free to just put your email address into the chat box and we'll answer your questions, and hopefully we can give you more detailed information than we might be able to do now with these questions that are on the screen. And so I think we'll just take these questions and we'll either ask Dr. Ryan's team to answer them, or we'll have Dr. McMurray contributing. So one of the questions is actually whether or not we have, will we be talking about students helping students at the secondary level? So Dr. Ryan, most of your students at this point are all in the elementary grades that you're focused on in this session, is that correct?
They are, but we have found that we've got a teacher or two that has been interested in trying to build this into their programs at the middle grades level, and we're also very interested in exploring some of our students who might have had some experiences with some very significant behaviors that we believe might have resulted from some significant frustration with their inability to access their education, might benefit from this if they are not able to access the traditional school day because they might have gotten themselves put out of school. We're very interested in trying to see if this can help fill some of those gaps that might have occurred for those students as well.
I think it's really important too, this is Bob McMurray, that to point out that this variability model, we've shown this in the cognitive sciences, in adults, in elderly adults even. It's been used as a cognitive aging approach to dealing with cognitive aging, and in infants. These are principles that apply throughout the lifespan. And I think as kids get older and older and the traditional mastery model has failed them more and more, it only makes it more essential that we approach learning from this different point of view.
And Dr. McMurray, the team at Bridgeport actually worked with you to perform the randomized study there of 9th grade students. Can you very quickly, I know you don't have that study right in front of you, we weren't expecting to be talking about middle school students, but could you address what the differences were that you found? They worked for about 12 weeks in the program there.
Yeah, so these were 7th, 8th, and 9th graders, if I recall, though the majority were the older students.
They were
They were all 9th graders.
All 9th graders.
Stand corrected. And these kids got access code for about 12 weeks, not quite the full curriculum, and half of them had been assigned to receive it, half of them did not. We got more of a business as usual approach. And then we looked at differences in reading comprehension after the intervention, and found small but mostly significant improvements in the group that got access code.
Right. And I think the report from Bridgeport was they were so interested that they wanted to try it with a bigger number of students, but to start earlier.
Yes, and unfortunately they stopped randomizing at that point because they felt like it was working for them.
Right. Our next question, and by the way, we do have a, based on our experience with these middle school and early high school students, we have created a version that targets those youngsters very specifically with some very engaging passages now, so that the actual learning of the content is stepped up a bit and is more engaging. And incorporated in that, we also have a new spelling program. Our next question is about whether or not English language learners have been students who have benefited from this approach. And in the randomized study that we actually performed in West Des Moines, we had students who were English language learners, and there was no difference in the performance of the English language learners and the English-speaking students.
Yeah, that was a very small study, so it's hard to draw very firm conclusions. We had quite a bit more in the more basic science work that I talked about, and we found the same principles apply, that variability seemed to help the ELL kids just as much as the normal kids. I think the ELL kids are coming with a slightly different challenge. They have to map these letters onto vowel sounds that sound very different to them, that are going to be used very differently in their language. And that's, I think, one more reason why for them the traditional rules of phonics may not apply. Thinking about it that way just doesn't work because they're coming from a different knowledge base. The sounds of their language are very different, and so I think that's another reason why you want to adopt a more skill-based approach or procedural approach.
Wow, that's great. Thank you for that answer. And then there is a question about those students who might not have problems with fluency but still struggle with comprehension. We know that there are many, many reasons that students struggle with comprehension, and the contributions to that are immense. What we have found is that there have been students that it appeared that they had fluency, but once the teachers actually saw that they were using a lot more cognitive energy to make meaning because they didn't have an underlying automaticity, and once they could better generalize, their comprehension actually stepped up. We do have a question here, and David, I think as a psychologist, school psychologist, perhaps you could answer this one. What kind of assessments might be used to identify the youngsters for whom this might be appropriate?
Well, the type of assessment might depend on the type of referral. So as I alluded to a bit earlier, usually the starting point is an academic deficit. And so for most of our kiddos it's reading, but for some of our kiddos it's math. And so depending on what that academic deficit was, that will drive my selection of test batteries. Most time I start with a general IQ measure that will give me a smattering of different process and areas. So what I typically do is try to select the IQ battery that'll give me a reading of the child's overall intellectual ability, and then also give me about 4 or 5 processing skills that can tell me if they struggle in one or more of those processing skills, if that struggles explain the academic deficits that we're seeing. For reading specifically, we're really keyed in on the processing skill of processing speed and also phonological processing. And if there are deficits in those areas, then a test battery that assesses those can be really useful.
And this is Kate. From the perspective of students who are not yet in a special education or who will not be in a special education process, our district conducts a universal screening of a quick 1-minute oral reading fluency screener. That, and with kindergarten, we look at phoneme segmentation, which is certainly one of the most important skills to take a look at. And those are just quick assessments. We have some other assessments that teachers use, running records, those kinds of things. But we find that those really help us identify those students who may be at risk.
When I was choosing, this is Carla, when I was choosing the students that I was going to use Access Code with, I started with my reading fluency scores from our universal screener at the beginning of school. And I took all the students that had the low reading fluency scores and then looked at deeper in to find out why those scores were there. But that gave me a really good starting point to find out who should be put into the program.
Okay, and I'm just quickly looking here to see if we have any other questions that we haven't hit upon. I think, let's see, if I could turn this back to Dr. Ryan's team. I believe one of your team differentiated between a learning disability and a learning difference. And the participant is asking if you could identify the key difference between those two descriptors.
Yes, that's a great question, and that's one of the reasons we needed to have one of the members of our team of school psychologists here with us today.
Right. So, and what I talked about earlier was that the importance, the emphasis that we place on research-based interventions. So the idea being that if a child is resistant to research-based intervention, then you can say that that's a legitimate disability. However, some children struggle, but once they are implemented with a good, solid research-based intervention, they tend to improve. And so the difference there is their lack or response to intervention. And so you can look at how they progress after they've been receiving some intervention, and that can be a key indicator of whether or not we are in fact dealing with a disability.
Versus perhaps a lack of exposure to good, solid instruction.
Right, right. Well, thank you very much for answering that, and I would also like to thank all of those who are listening as participants, and to all the panelists, including Dr. McMurray, for coming today and talking about something that I think is one of the most important issues that we have to solve in the schools, and we really appreciate learning about this new approach and how it applies. And we will be conducting 2 more webinars, one that specifically deals with middle school youngsters, and we'll be showing data we've collected from that population. And then we will be talking about English language learners. And we touched a little bit about that webinar today, but we'll be have participants in that area, and we'll announce those coming up webinars. Thank you all very much, and hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.